Hey everyone. All right, thanks for joining us. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about how to manage and distribute your tokens. So let me see here. This is really an important part of any project. It's how you specify how the incentives will work for the participants that are involved in your project over a long period of time. So you need to be thinking about this from the point of view that you need to incentivize the right participants in your network or your slice of the ecosystem for as long as you can to be involved. And if you get this wrong, essentially, you're going to be kind of in a corner, and it's likely to affect the long-term success of your project very, very significantly. So it's really worth paying attention to and making sure that you get right in the first instance. You don't want to, for example, give too many tokens to people that aren't going to be active in the project early, because that will, of course, limit the amount of tokens you can give to people over time as it develops and so on and so forth. It's very important to get right. But the problem is that it's also a highly opinionated topic. So I'm going to offer you, I guess, one way of looking at the picture, and other people will have different views. And you'll find that through the process of fundraising, you're likely going to have to modify your token allocation table a few times in order to get all of your stakeholders comfortable with it. There is no silver bullet for how this should work, and a lot of the views people have are completely contradictory to one another. So you should expect it to be a sort of process getting it right. But I can offer you at least an outline of like ballpark figures of where to start. Okay, so first we're going to do that, and we're going to look a bit deeper into how you can use reward systems to help market and essentially grow the adoption of your application. So here's a basic structure. It's going to contain like 3 parts approximately, or 3 fundamental parts, and then the rest will be allocated to sales, and we'll get to that in a moment. So founder allocations. You need to make sure that as the person founding the project, and realistically, we live in a world where founding the project is going to require, probably 2 to 5 years of your life, maybe 3 to 5 years of your life in a very, very intense fashion. It will be everything you think about, everything you do all day, every day, with few breaks for that period of time. You need to make sure that you are actually appropriately incentivized to go through that process. So you need to make sure that you and your other co-founders own enough of the output of the thing you're creating, such that when something goes wrong in the middle of the night, 1 year in or something like this, you're going to get out of bed at 3 a.m. to go fix it every single time. And if you don't get this right, then the whole thing will fall apart. You need the key founders to be well incentivized. This is fundamental. So the range here is pretty big, 8% to 15%. First thing you've got to understand about these percentages is that unlike the traditional equity startup world, these, how would you say? Yeah. Token distributions generally tend to be non-dilutionary. You're never going to have any more tokens. So if you found a company, for example, in the Web2 space, you and your co-founders will start with like 100% of the equity. And maybe in your first round, you print 20% more, which you give to investors. And over time, you'll dilute it down. Down to around a range of, I think, Mark Zuckerberg is a very good example of this. He owns 11% of Facebook still. So you're diluted like that. But in the crypto world, we tend to have static fixed supplies, and then we distribute those tokens over a period of time. So you kind of start at the end, if that makes sense. Has the benefit that you can't be diluted any more than you expect to be, which is obviously a positive, but also the downside and the risk that you're not going to be able to just print more of the ownership of a project in the future. So you need to make sure that you get the allocations right to begin with. Otherwise, you're going to cause serious problems that only manifest like 4 or 5 years down the line, which is very painful. So make sure to get it right. Okay. Another thing to note on the founder allocations is that you need to make sure that you essentially, fight for yourself on this. Nobody else is going to argue for large founder allocations. It's in everyone else's best interest to leave you with almost as little as possible. And you'll note that unfortunately some VCs in the space will be quite greedy about this, not realizing that there's a necessary incentive for the core people to get out of bed in the middle of the night to go fix things sometimes, and they need an incentive to do so, where they'll want you to have a smaller and smaller allocation. It is your responsibility to fight for yourself in making sure you get a fair allocation of the thing that you are building. No one else will do it for you. So that's one thing to note. In response to that, of course, you should take a significant lockup. So 4 years is standard from the equity world, but I would personally recommend a 5-year lockup. And this will vest 20% or 25% per year, depending. I think it makes sense for the founders to have a longer lockup than team members. So for example, at Arweave, I have a 5-year lockup on my tokens, and team members have a 4-year lockup. That's a reasonable split, I think. Obviously, the rules of a lockup from the team and founder perspective, this has come up in the ecosystem recently. You don't get the tokens regardless of your contribution to the project. No, you must contribute to the project significantly for the period of time at which the tokens are locked up. And if you don't, then you should expect you shouldn't receive the tokens after that period. So if there's, for example, a 25% chunk after 1 year, 25% chunk after the second year, if you then leave the project, you should not expect to have the rest of the tokens. The idea is for this to be an incentive to make sure that the core people stay aligned with the project over a long period of time. So make sure that you discuss this with your co-founders up front, and you're all clear on it. This is the last few days in the ecosystem. Unfortunately, there's a project that has questions around this now because it wasn't clear enough. So you need to make sure that you do that up front. Team allocations. So in this, you'll want to make sure that you have enough tokens set aside so that you can give slices of ownership of the project to members of the team that join after the founding team. So founding team is, we'd expect that to be like the people that are most active in the first few months and then the years afterwards. The people that join in those first few months. And so typically they're the people that are taking the highest level of risk because you don't have capital to pay salaries and so on and so forth. So you need to make sure that there is still a very significant allocation of tokens to people that join afterwards. 10% would be a little bit on the low side, but I've seen that in the real world. And 20%, I think, would be a pretty significant chunk. And you'll find, of course, because people, generally act along their incentives, that the more firepower you have here, the better. Of course, what you want to be doing with this over time is giving decreasingly large quantities to each new person that joins the team. So if you start with like the first employee that might be going with the fourth member of your team, something like that, then you should be thinking in the single digit decimals of numbers of percent to give to this sort of contributor. But over time, the 100th person, then you're thinking like 0.01% or something like this. You can see there's an exponentially decaying curve. Team lockups, generally from the equity world, people take 4-year lockup, 25% per year. Typically, it would be literally 25% every year, so in chunks. But there are some people that do linear vesting as well. So, if you leave after 18 months, then you get what? 37.5% of the tokens, something like this. One underexplored, but I think potentially very, very sensible incentive mechanism you can look at is exponentially decaying vesting schedules. So the problem you, of course, have with the system I've outlined before is that at some point in time, the employee or the founder becomes fully vested. And that means that they don't necessarily have a locked incentive around the long-term outcomes of the project. And this is a real problem. Like you saw at Google, I think in mid-2000s, people started turning up to work with that said fully vested as a way of saying, politely, screw you, it doesn't matter. I'm fully vested. I've already got my millions. You can fire me or say whatever you like. It doesn't matter. Whereas, of course, there's supposed to be an incentive for people to, contribute to the project diligently over a long period of time. You can potentially make this happen by having either Bitcoin like halving schedules. So you say, I don't know, half of the tokens are released in the first 2 years, and then another half of the tokens, quarter of the full amount of tokens are released in the next 2 years, and so on, halving over time. Or you could do something that's literally exponentially decaying. And the neat thing about this is that over time, if things are going well, value should continue to accrue to your project. And subsequently, even if you're on the fourth halving or something, you're down to 6.725% or whatever it is, tokens released per year, then actually, the value of the project should be far more than 8 times what it was at the beginning, or whatever that is, maybe more than 8. Yes, it should be far higher than that. So actually now the incentive for the next component is even higher than it was at the beginning. And so this creates essentially a perpetual, as long as the startup and the community continues to accrue value, it creates a perpetually continuing incentive to take part and a reward. This is probably an effective system, but I haven't seen many people play with it. I think that's partly because it's a mechanism design that makes it feels more intuitive in the Web3 space, where we play with all of these mechanisms all the time, whereas in the Web2 space, I would say things a little bit more primitive, frankly, on the incentive designs, or the incentive design structure, incentive design for the organizations, the structures of the organizations. Okay, mining and usage rewards. So it said varied here because it really depends on, you got to think about this from the point of view of who is going to provide the most value to the network over time. Are you thinking of building a social media system where people are going to be incentivized to take part? If so, maybe to some extent the content needs to be rewarded potentially just as much as the development of the platform or protocol needs to be rewarded. You got to think of it like the total package that you're providing. How much of the value comes from technical side of things? How much is from content? How much is from people running infrastructure? All the rest of it. And so here, in some cases, I'm trying to think of an example that's appropriate. In some cases, you might find that most of the value of the protocol is provided just by the technical creation of the protocol itself. In which case, and I think Verify, for example, would fall into this bucket. In which case, actually, most of the tokens should sit with the people. Sit with the people that are building the thing over time. That makes the most sense. However, if it's something like Bitcoin mining, for example, you really need a high amount of security bootstrapped in those early days. And so it makes sense for, in the case of Bitcoin, literally all of the tokens, but in a more modern example, it wouldn't be quite all, but it would be some significant portion going to those miners for providing security to the network. So you've got to think about this like, where does the value come from? How do I reward the people that are going to produce that value such that they are going to do it in appropriate quantities? We're going to get into some sort of strategies you can use for provisioning those rewards later, but this is just the kind of broad base of the concept. Okay, and then whatever's left makes sense to put towards token sales over time. But you've got to be careful here. The question is, how many token sales do you expect to have? Like for a pure decentralized protocol, and I think a lot of these web applications should tend that way, you've got to be thinking from the point of view that, okay, yes, I need to raise X amount of dollars in order to work on this for 2 years, something like that. And as we discussed in our talk last week, it makes sense at this point to try and put 2 or 3 years worth of runway in the bank so that you can depend on it while the machinations of the market continue. You've got to think about it from that point of view, but you've also got to make sure that, well, how long do you think it's going to take for example, a social media protocol to get full adoption across the world in a way that is self-sustaining? Maybe that takes 8 or 9 years, right? So you need to structure this allocation such that you're not selling too many at the beginning, it's so that over time, as the value of the token rises, you can sell fewer and fewer tokens in order to extend your runway of the core team as long as is necessary to reach full decentralization and the point at which the protocol self-perpetuates. So this is very varied, but I would caution about selling too many of the tokens that you have set aside for token sales up front. Of course, there's this complexity that right now, the position of the market is that you shouldn't be expecting necessarily to be able to sell tokens, 1 year or 18 months from now. You might have to bridge that gap early. And then this comes down to a question of valuation and how many tokens you're willing to part with and so on. Of course, you should be thinking about vesting schedules for these tokens as well. And I think, frankly, token sale allocations, you should be trying to get as high a vesting, as long a vesting schedule as you possibly can. If you can really swing it, then you should be looking at 4 to 5 years, which is a typical venture horizon for how long people are expected to hold tokens. Hold equity in companies before the companies eventually go public in some form or sell to another company. So it's a liquidity event. But this being crypto, everything works on shorter timescales, and you should be thinking that around the 2-year range is doing reasonably well on this front. But of course, the more you have people staked into the long-term success of the project, the higher the likelihood that there will be incentive alignment between the team and the founders and the token sale participants. And this is really important. You don't want to end up in a situation where these two are very, very misaligned. Ideally, you want them to be mirrored. Token sale participants have the same terms as founders or team members. That would be the ideal, although it's hard to get that from the market often. But you really don't want to end up in a situation where there's a huge amount of tokens that are freely circulating in the market, and the team and the founders have 4 or 5, or even I've heard of, although I haven't spoken to these founders, I've only heard of it through investors, so I'm not sure I can completely count on the legitimacy, but people talking up to 10-year locking schedule for founders, because this obviously means that the people that have the tokens today are going to be trying to see the token price rise in 6 months. And the founder out there with a 10-year lockup is thinking on a much, much slower timescale. And that will encourage you to make different decisions, whether you'll be thinking about the short term or the long term. So this is something to really make sure that you get right. Align those lock schedules as closely as you can, with the caveat that you should be expecting this to be a difficult process with the market. Of course, where that process gets easier is when the sale is very, very highly in demand. So if you've got much, much more offers than you have tokens to sell at the price that you're selling them at, then this can be a lever that you can pull to start really weeding out the people that are only in this for the midterm gain, rather than the long-term gains, which you as the founder of the project should be incentivized around. So that can be a helpful thing to do in situations where, of course, you don't want to just simply raise the price. That is another strategy, although typically the market doesn't like that one too much. Okay, final component, or rather, so the final component is usage rewards. But now we can get into some depth about, how you can think about this, how you can make it work for you. And so I think the core thing to understand here is that one of the key advantages that Web3 products have over Web2 products is that they can reward users with ownership of the product or the protocol itself. And so in the Web2 world, it kind of works like this. The company, so the founders really at the beginning, go to VCs and they sell equity in reward for, unfortunately this label is missing, fiat capital. And then there's a customer acquisition cost, and the company pays that either to users. So for example, PayPal gained a large amount of its user base at the beginning by simply giving $10 to anyone that opened an account, full stop. So that literally the customer acquisition cost was the marketing that needed to go into getting people to make accounts, and then the $10 per user. So you could think maybe their customer acquisition cost was $12 or something. So the company is going to VCs, selling equity, selling the ownership that the founders would otherwise end up with, getting dollars, which they're then buying users with, essentially, on a very transactional basis. Web3 can be very different. you can just have an organization which gives ownership to its users as a way of acquiring them. And there's lots of different ways that you can structure this, what we can look into. I think, as we'll see, a lot of it's underexplored at this point. But I think this might be the superpower of the space. If you're not necessarily that great at marketing, and you don't have that background, maybe you're more focused on developer development and being part of developer communities, then you can really leverage this to your advantage and have it take some of the work out of the traditional marketing that you would have to do in a startup. So you can think of tokens as the bulk of your marketing budget. And if at some point later you have to liquidate some tokens to actually get some fiat, which you can then use on marketing, then so be it. But you could put aside in your token allocation table, this many tokens for what are essentially adoption activities. This makes a lot of sense, and I think can be really powerful. And another thing that it gets you, which is how would you say, is not completely obvious from the beginning, is that for the reasons that it's good to have good VCs invested in your project over the long term, because they're essentially incentivized to help it succeed. You can get that from your users now as well. So it can be like not just every user is a customer where they have this transactional relationship where the customer understands that they're being sort of squeezed on price by the company in traditional sense, who is attempting to extract as much value as possible from them in return for as small a cost to the company as possible. Instead, you can have this relationship where actually by using the product, the users become the owners that are going to profit from the success of the project over a long period. That's kind of investment side of things, so holding the token such that it accrues value. And B, simply taking part in the profits because it's a profit sharing token. They hold the token and the fees that are being paid by others in the future are accruing to them in some form, partial, it's part of the fees. And a third component, which is elegant, is that your users become part of your governing body. And this means that they feel a real connection and ownership of the project in a tangible way, which is almost impossible for a Web2 startup to conjure this feeling. And so I think this could be very, very powerful as we go down the route to adoption of these PermaWeb applications, particularly ones backed by profit-sharing communities. So let's go through some basic reward strategies that you can use, although I'd say there are many, many more. First is obvious, usage mining. So you use the project or product, or protocol even, you gain tokens. Very, very simple. Encourages a sort of mining type behavior where people are really just using the product in order to gain access to the tokens, which can be negative for sure. Although interestingly, I think it creates a sort of frenzy whereby people rapidly onboard to the product. And yes, they use it just for the sake of using it to begin with, to extract value, really. But over time, of course, if you have these tokens that are given locked, then they are incentivized and staked into the success of the product. So now you have more people out there, more essentially spreading the word on your behalf or rooting for you when they see you, in CoinDesk or something like this. They're like, oh, I own a bit of that. That's cool. I want that to succeed. They share it with their friends and so on. All of those positive effects that we've spoken about. But another thing it does is also just onboards people to using your platform. So when the natural need arises to use the user system, then they know where to go. Like Arweave is a great example of this. Arweave had a usage mining program, so people essentially they really competed for a slice of the daily pie of tokens that were released to upload more data. So this meant lots of people were just really incentivized to go try the product. But after a while, we found that those users became sticky because now they understand that if they want to store a piece of data permanently, then Arweave is the way to do it. And they find all the interesting features of the application. So you're sort of, it's like they come for the incentive, stay for the product. You can think of it as. That's an effective way of doing it. I would say that the distribution mechanics here really fit into one of two categories. Either you are distributing tokens flat per usage, in some form, or one usage per day. You can have some kind of cap like this. Or you are gaining points, and then those points are converted at the end of some time period, say a day, say a week, into some portion of the tokens that are available during that time step. So for example, if I say that there are 1,000 Arweave tokens available per day for the next 30 days, then if I upload 50 gigabytes and you upload 200 gigabytes, then I end up with 20% of the tokens from that day, and you end up with 80%. This is elegant because it caps the amount of tokens that you might have to distribute during the period. So that's always helpful, because of course the alternate, you say, I will give you 10 Arweave tokens for every gigabyte that you upload, has no limit. So that can be dangerous. And it also has this effect that at the beginning, the mechanism is excessively profitable. And that sounds bad until you know the real world dynamics of this are basically that people tell their friends, because like, hey, I did this thing last night and I have $200. Isn't that crazy? And then those friends tell their friends until actually the reward starts to get lower and lower until it reaches basically opportunity cost, where a new person looks at it and they're like, oh, okay, so I could do this, but like, I'm only going to get 20, 30 cents. I'm going to go do something else with my time. But that means that you're now bringing in the maximal number of people for the number of tokens that you're giving out. It's an elegantly self-organizing system to get the lowest possible customer acquisition cost in terms of tokens. That's one way of looking at it. Obviously, we discussed this, I think, a couple of weeks ago. There's this danger that because it is a competitive process, actually, one person storing more data actually leads to another person receiving a lower reward. Then this can create potentially negative community dynamics. And this is described as something that happens in blockchain mining communities, tend to be on the more negative side of things, because there are always people being disappointed by the rewards that they're getting. And this is just a natural, unfortunate effect of competition. So while it's elegant from a mechanism design perspective, you got to think through carefully what it means from a community development perspective as well. So just a word of caution there. Usage fees goes to tokens. And I think this is underexplored. Okay, you get this. So if we have this, Arweave system of like real usage mining, which is similar to liquidity mining from DeFi, then you have this incentive for people to use the product if they were not going to use the product. And then the idea is that the incentive brings people and they stay for the actual utility of the project or product later. Interesting twist on this would be, what if you, okay, we all know that there's fees associated with using blockchain networks. What if you give people only the reciprocal quantity of tokens for the fees that they've paid? So if I pay 1 R to upload a piece of data to Arweave, then yes, why not receive 1 R worth of Arweave tokens? And so now it's as if the product is free from my point of view as the user, but I'm not hyper incentivized to take part and just use the product for the sake of gaining the tokens. And so you're cutting down some of the barrier to people wanting to use the product in the first place, and also replacing it, once they actually do use the product, replacing it with this sense of ownership, which has these positive attributes that we've described. So this could be really powerful. I don't think very many projects have actually looked at this. I think that's a mistake. I think there's probably something really helpful here. One extra thing you can do is to use multiples. So, okay, you use 1 Arweave token, I'll give you 1.2 Arweave tokens worth of Arweave tokens. And so now I'm not going to do it if I didn't plan to use the product anyway, but it's an extra bonus and makes me maybe slightly more activated to use the product than I otherwise would be. So I think that's an interesting avenue to explore. Okay, another one is sharing. So the basic version of this is ref loops. Back in 2014 to 2017 period, through the Bitcoin forum bounty subforum, there was a huge number of reward programs for new blockchain projects that basically just said, follow us on Twitter and retweet, and we will give you some tokens that represent ownership in the network or product or whatever it happens to be. Lots of sketchy behavior and scams here. Highly dubious, I would say. However, if done right, these can be really effective. So thinking about, if, I don't know, using Arweave again as an example, you upload your file to Arweave, maybe there's some matching between an Arweave that you're taking part in already. And then if you share the link, there's like a small ref component that says, okay, and now you also get 0.2 Arweave tokens for each R spent by this person that you've brought to the platform. Then that seems like a perfectly sensible system. Should probably be quite effective for getting people to press that share button, which is how you're going to get more users to see your platform and then to also take part in it. One of the things you need to understand if you're from like a development background, as I was, is, and might not be obvious, is like, in order for people to actually want to take notice of your product, typically in 80% of cases, you have to get them to see a reference to the product, the name, or some sort of description of what it does, or an endorsement by a friend, something like this, like 7 or 8 times before they're actually going to bother engaging themselves. And the more skeptical the community, so I'd say developers are a fairly skeptical community, then and lots of our projects at this point are, infrastructure focused on serving developers. Yeah, the more skeptical they are, the higher the number of exposures they'll have to get to your name before they even give you, 20 seconds of their time, jumping to your homepage. So increasing the number of times the name of the project is shared is really valuable. Yeah, you just got to make sure that you do it in such a way that people don't negatively connotate your name with scammy behavior, like people retweeting for the sake of tokens on Twitter and that kind of stuff. Yeah, just watch how you implement it, but the basic principle is strong. And question mark goes to tokens, because I think there's a million different ways you can do this. And depending on the application, there might be other types of activity that you want to incentivize. So people writing content, for example, and contributing by filling the catalog of things that just consumers on the website can look at, then yeah, you should give them tokens. Obviously in core blockchain projects like Bitcoin, you're giving people tokens for providing a technical utility to the network, which is that of security. But there's a million different ways, and I think this is largely underexplored. And what's really exciting about these PermaWeb applications that everyone here is building and others outside is that we can explore that space. And I think it'll be a secret weapon or superpower, whatever you want to call it, for competing against Web 2 companies once we get there, because it's something that they fundamentally cannot do and works very, very well for pushing adoption. Just as long as you can make sure that it doesn't look too financially motivated. And that comes back to the questions around sharing as incentives. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Yeah, really excited to chat on GatherTown about this and other topics and conversations that come up. Yeah, see you there, everyone.